The moment they tried to close the coffin, Brian lunged. Not a playful jump, not the excited leap of a golden retriever greeting his owner after a long day. This was different. Desperate. Asterisk. Violent asterisk even. His claws scraped against the polished wood, leaving white scratches across the dark surface. And the sound, God. The sound was like nails on a chalkboard, mixed with something primal, something that made everyone in the room freeze. Brian, no, come here, boy. Marcus, the officer's younger brother, reached for the dog's collar. But Brian twisted away with a strength that didn't match his usually gentle nature. The dog's eyes were wild, darting between the faces surrounding the coffin and back to the still figure inside. His owner, the young officer who'd rescued him from a shelter 3 years ago. The man who was supposed to be times dead, asterisk. If you want to discover what Brian heard inside that coffin, the sound that changed everything, subscribe now. Because what happens next will make you question everything you thought you knew about the bond between humans and their dogs. Hit that subscribe button, because this story is only just beginning. And trust me, you won't believe where it goes. But here's the thing that made everyone uncomfortable. The detail nobody wanted to acknowledge out loud. Brian wasn't howling like dogs do when they mourn. He wasn't lying beside the coffin in that heartbreaking, defeated way you see in movies. He was times panicking asterisk, like he knew something they didn't. The funeral director, a thin man with practiced sympathy in his eyes, stepped forward. "It's normal," he said quietly to Marcus and the officer's mother, who was clutching a tissue so tightly it had shredded in her fingers. "Dogs often react this way to loss. They don't understand death the way we do." But the mother, Susan, couldn't look away from Brian. The dog had positioned himself directly at the head of the coffin now, his front paws planted on the edge, his nose pressed against the small gap where the lid hadn't quite closed yet. And he was doing something strange, something that sent a cold finger of doubt down her spine. He was times listening asterisk. Not just staring, not just whining. Brian's entire body had gone still except for his ears, which were pricked forward in that intense way dogs get when they're tracking a sound humans can't hear. His breathing had slowed. Calculated. Focused. "When?" Susan's voice cracked. She cleared her throat and tried again. "When did you say he died, exactly?" The doctor who'd pronounced death stood near the doorway, looking uncomfortable. Dr. Harrison had been the family's physician for 15 years. He was the one who delivered the news just 18 hours ago. The officer had been in a car accident, suffered massive trauma, no pulse, no breath, gone. The pronouncement had been made at the scene, standard procedure. "Mrs. Patterson, I know this is difficult. I asked you a question." Susan's grief was hardening into something else, something that looked like desperate hope, which is sometimes more dangerous than despair. "What time exactly?" "Approximately 2:47 p.m. yesterday." Dr. Harrison's professional mask slipped for just a second. "Susan, I understand what you're thinking. But I checked him myself. There was no heartbeat, no respiration. His pupils were..." Brian's bark cut through the room like a gunshot. Not a normal bark. This was sharp, demanding, almost times angry, asterisk. The kind of sound that makes you stop mid-sentence because your body recognizes a warning before your brain catches up. The dog's eyes locked onto the doctor with an intensity that bordered on accusatory, then swiveled back to the coffin. And that's when everyone heard it. Pause. A sound so faint, so impossible, that at first they thought it was the old house settling, or wind through the windows, or their collective grief playing tricks on them. But Brian heard it clearly. His entire body tensed, muscles coiling like he was about to spring into action. He placed his paw carefully, precisely on the coffin lid, and pushed. Not scratched, asterisk, pushed asterisk, like he was trying to open it. "Someone needs to get that dog under control," the funeral director said, his professional calm starting to fracture. He'd seen grief manifest in strange ways over 30 years in the business, but this was different. This was making him uncomfortable, and that was saying something. Marcus moved toward Brian again, but the dog spun, teeth bared not in aggression, but in protection. "Keep back, don't touch this. Something's wrong." Every line of his body screamed it. The neighbors who'd gathered to pay respects started murmuring. Mrs. Chen from next door whispered to her husband in Mandarin, something about animals knowing things. about trusts and instincts that humans had lost. Mr. Roberts from across the street just shook his head slowly, like he was witnessing something he couldn't quite process. And then, thud, everyone stopped breathing. It was small, barely perceptible, but it came from times inside times the coffin. Did you? Marcus started. Probably just settling, the funeral director said quickly. Too quickly. Bodies sometimes release gas, cause movement. It's perfectly. Thud. Brian went absolutely berserk, but not the way you'd expect. He didn't bark frantically or claw at the wood. Instead, he did something that made Susan's blood run cold. He started times digging *. Right there on the carpet beside the coffin, his paws moved in rapid succession, the same motion he'd used to dig up a bone in the backyard. Except this wasn't playful. This was purposeful. He was trying to get times under times the coffin. Like he was trying to reach someone who'd been buried. Oh my God, Susan whispered. Her hands flew to her mouth. Oh my God, he's not. He can't be. Mrs. Patterson, please. Dr. Harrison's voice had taken on an edge of concern, but now it was concern times for her *, not about the situation. You're in shock. This is a grief response. The dog is simply bang, The coffin lid shifted. Not much. Maybe an inch. But at times moved *. And this time there was no mistaking it for settling, or gas, or imagination. Something inside was trying to get out. And Brian loyal, desperate, knowing times Brian had been trying to tell them all along. To understand why nobody wanted to believe what Brian was trying to tell them, you have to understand what happened the day before. Officer David Patterson, 32, decorated, beloved by his community, had been driving home from a double shift. The accident report would later call it a single-vehicle collision due to driver fatigue. His patrol car had drifted off a rural highway at approximately 2:30 p.m., struck a utility pole, and rolled twice before landing in a shallow ditch. Passers-by found him unconscious. No pulse. No breathing. Emergency responders arrived within 8 minutes fast, by rural standards, but they couldn't revive him at the scene. Dr. Harrison, who happened to be at the nearby clinic when the call came in, pronounced death at 2:47 p.m. It should have been straightforward. Tragic, heartbreaking, but straightforward. Except David Patterson had a condition nobody knew about, not even him. Catalepsy, a rare neurological disorder that mimics death so convincingly that even trained medical professionals can be fooled. Patients enter states of rigidity. Their breathing becomes so shallow it's undetectable without specialized equipment, and their pulse can slow to 1 or 2 beats per minute, invisible to a standard check. But Brian had noticed something was off even before the accident. That morning, when David had come home from his first shift to grab a quick meal before heading back out, Brian had been different, clingy. He'd followed David from room to room with unusual intensity, whining softly whenever David moved toward the door. At one point, he'd actually grabbed David's pant leg in his teeth, gently, but firmly trying to keep him from leaving. "What's gotten into you, buddy?" David had laughed, scratching behind Brian's ears. "I'll be back before dinner, promise." Brian had watched from the window as David drove away, and neighbors would later report that the dog had started howling about 10 minutes before the accident call came in. Like he times knew, like some part of him understood that his owner was in danger. When the family got the news, Brian had been home alone. Marcus had driven to the house to pick him up, thinking the dog should be there when they said goodbye. But the moment Brian saw Marcus's face, before Marcus had even said a word, the dog had bolted for the car. Scratched at the doors. Tried to climb through the window. "He wants to see David," Marcus had told his mother on the phone, his voice thick with tears. "God, Mom, it's like he doesn't understand." But maybe Brian understood better than any of them. By the time they brought David's body to the family home, a tradition in their small town, one last night before the burial, Brian had been pacing, not the lazy, content wandering of a dog with nothing to do. This was measured, purposeful. Back and forth across the living room, his eyes fixed on the front door, waiting. When the funeral home van pulled up, Brian had gone still, watching. And when they carried the coffin inside, When they set it on the stand in the living room where David had played with Brian just that morning, the dog had approached slowly. Susan had expected howling, crying, the kind of grief-stricken response that would break her heart all over again. Instead, Brian had pressed his nose against the wood and Times sniffed asterisk, long, careful inhales. Then he'd looked up at Susan with an expression she couldn't quite read, part confusion, part hope. "He probably smells David's cologne," the funeral director had offered. "It's very common. It can bring comfort." But that wasn't the look of a dog finding comfort. That was the look of a dog who'd found something that didn't make sense. Throughout the evening, as family and friends came to pay respects, Brian hadn't left the coffin. He'd stationed himself beside it like a guard, his eyes tracking every person who approached, every hand that touched the wood. And when the funeral director suggested they close the viewing and let the family rest before tomorrow's burial, Brian had finally made his move. That's when the real panic started. That's when Brian's gentle nature vanished, replaced by something primal and urgent. That's when everyone realized that maybe times, the dog knew something they were desperately trying not to believe. Because believing it meant accepting something impossible. And accepting the impossible meant confronting a horror that shouldn't exist in the modern world, that they'd almost buried a living man. "Open it." Susan's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. She wasn't asking, she wasn't suggesting, she was Times demanding asterisk, and the steel in her tone made everyone in the room freeze. "Mrs. Patterson, I really don't think," Dr. Harrison started. "I said Times open it asterisk." The funeral director stepped forward, his face pale. "Ma'am, with all due respect, opening a casket after viewing can be very distressing for families. The body has already been prepared, and if there's been any decomposition or settling." Brian barked once, sharp, like he was backing Susan up. "Asterisk. Listen to her. Asterisk. My son has been dead for 18 hours, Susan said. And God." The way she emphasized that word Times dead. Times like she was challenging it. Daring it to be true. 18 hours. And in that entire time, this dog hasn't eaten, hasn't slept, hasn't left that coffin for more than a minute. Dogs grieve, yes. But this isn't grief. This is Times urgency asterisk. She turned to face the room full of neighbors and family, her eyes blazing. "I've known Brian since David brought him home. He's the gentlest creature you've ever met. Children pull his tail, he just wags it harder. But look at him now. Asterisk. Look at him asterisk." Everyone looked. Brian's entire body was rigid, his gaze locked on the coffin like it was the only thing in the universe that mattered. His chest heaved with rapid breaths, but he wasn't panting from exertion. He was hyperventilating, panicking. And every few seconds, he'd tilt his head, that classic dog gesture, like he was trying to make sense of a sound he was hearing. A sound nobody else could detect. What if? Susan's voice broke. She swallowed hard and tried again. What if Dr. Harrison made a mistake? The room erupted in murmurs. Impossible. How could a doctor make that kind of mistake? In this day and age? With all our medical technology? But Dr. Harrison had gone very quiet, very still. And when Susan looked at him, really looked at him, she saw something in his eyes that made her stomach drop. Doubt? The accident scene was chaotic. He said slowly, carefully, like he was picking his way through a minefield of implications. "There was a lot of blood, head trauma. I checked for a pulse at the carotid and radial arteries. I checked for breath. I performed all the standard." "How long did you check?" Marcus interrupted. He'd been quiet until now, standing in the corner with his arms crossed, trying to hold himself together. But now his voice was sharp, accusing. "How long?" "The standard 30 seconds for pulse, and 30 times seconds asterisk?" Marcus took a step forward. "My brother might have been alive, and you checked for times 30 seconds asterisk?" "That's the protocol." Dr. Harrison's professional calm was cracking. "In cases of severe trauma, if there's no detectable pulse or respiration after 30 seconds, and pupils are fixed and dilated, we asterisk, thud, 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 asterisk." This time, there was no mistaking it. 3 clear, distinct sounds from inside the coffin. Not settling, not gas. Something times someone, Times, was moving in there. Mrs. Chen gasped and grabbed her husband's arm. Mr. Roberts backed toward the door. The funeral director looked like he might faint. And Brian. Brian climbed onto the coffin. Not aggressively, not frantically. He simply positioned himself on top of the closed lid, lay down, and pressed his ear against the wood. His entire body went still, except for his tail, which gave one small, controlled wag. The wag of a dog who'd found what he was looking for. Jesus Christ, Marcus whispered. He can hear him. Brian can times hear him, asterisk. That's impossible. But Dr. Harrison didn't sound convinced of his own words anymore. He sounded terrified. Susan moved toward the coffin, her hands shaking so badly she had to clasp them together. If there's even a if there's even a 1% possibility that my son is alive in there, we open it, now. The psychological trauma of seeing the funeral director tried once more. Asterisk now. Asterisk. The funeral director looked at Dr. Harrison. Dr. Harrison looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at Brian, who was still pressed against the coffin, his tail wagging faster now, his whole body vibrating with restrained energy. And then Marcus stepped forward and grabbed the lid. Wait, Dr. Harrison said. If he is alive, and I'm not saying he is, but if he is, we need to be prepared. Marcus, call 911. Get an ambulance here immediately. If we open this and he's in respiratory distress, we'll need... I'm opening it now, Marcus said flatly. You can prepare or not. His hands found the release latches. They were designed to be subtle, hidden in the woodwork, but the funeral director had shown them earlier during the viewing. 2 on each side. Press them simultaneously, and the lid would release. Brian jumped down from the coffin, but he didn't back away. He positioned himself right at the head of the casket, his body tense, ready to spring into action the moment the lid opened. On 3, Marcus said. His voice was steady now, determined. 1. Susan's hand found her mouth again, tears streaming down her face. Half terror, half hope, that deadly combination that can destroy you either way. 2. The room held its collective breath. Even the funeral director had stopped protesting, his face ashen, his professional detachment completely shattered. 3. The latches clicked. Marcus lifted the lid. And Brian's howl, pure, triumphant, victorious times, told them everything they needed to know before they even saw inside. David's eyes were half open. Not the glazed, empty stare of the dead. Not the fixed pupils Dr. Harrison had checked 18 hours ago. These eyes moved. Slowly, painfully, but they moved, tracking the faces leaning over the coffin with the confused awareness of someone waking from a nightmare. His chest rose, fell, rose again, so shallow you could miss it if you weren't looking. But Brian had been looking. Brian had been listening to that barely there breath for hours, refusing to accept what everyone else had declared as truth. Oh my God. Marcus's voice came out strangled. Oh my God, he's... David's mouth opened. Closed. A sound escaped, barely a whisper. More like air being pushed through a damaged windpipe. But it was there. Real. Alive. Susan's scream was primal. Not grief this time, pure, overwhelming relief mixed with horror. Because yes, her son was alive. But Jesus Christ, they'd almost buried him. Another few hours and he would have been 6 feet underground, conscious and suffocating in the dark, and nobody would have known until... She couldn't finish the thought. Brian jumped into the coffin. Not roughly, he was still gentle even now, even in his vindication, but with purpose. He positioned himself carefully beside David's body, his warm weight pressed against his owner's side, and started licking David's face. Small, careful licks, the way mother dogs revive their puppies. Get him out. Dr. Harrison had recovered from his shock and lurched into action. We need to get him out of there now, Marcus, support his head and neck. We don't know the extent of the spinal injuries. Mrs. Patterson, clear that couch. We need a flat surface. The room erupted into controlled chaos. Neighbors scattered to make space. Someone, Mr. Roberts, maybe was on the phone with 911, his voice high and urgent. The funeral director stood frozen, his face the color of old paper, probably calculating the lawsuits that were about to rain down on everyone involved. But Marcus and Dr. Harrison worked together with surprising efficiency, carefully lifting David from the coffin. His body was rigid, that cataleptic rigidity that had mimicked rigor mortis so convincingly. His skin was cold, but not corpse cold. There was a faint, almost imperceptible pulse at his throat. "How is this possible?" Marcus breathed, as they laid David on the couch. "How did you miss this?" "I didn't." Dr. Harrison's hands were shaking as he checked David's vitals again, this time with proper equipment pulled from his bag. The pupils were dilated. There was no detectable pulse. The accident trauma was severe. Every indication pointed to, except the dog. Susan's voice was quiet now, but it carried weight. She was kneeling beside the couch, one hand on David's chest, feeling the shallow rise and fall. The dog knew. Brian had climbed onto the couch too, squeezing himself into the small space between David and the back cushions. He was shaking, whether from exertion, relief, or lingering panic, nobody could tell. But he kept his body pressed against David's, his nose buried in his owner's neck, and he was making small, distressed sounds that broke everyone's heart. "The ambulance is 3 minutes out," Mr. Roberts called from the doorway. "They're bringing advanced life support." 3 minutes. David had been dead for 18 hours. And now they were counting survival in times minutes. Asterisk. Dr. Harrison worked quickly, assessing damage. Pupils are responding now, slowly, but responding. Heart rate is approximately 40 beats per minute. Respiration is 4 to 6 breaths per minute. He's in extreme bradycardia and hypoxic, but he's alive. Jesus Christ, he's alive, asterisk. "What happened to him?" Susan demanded. "What would cause this?" Dr. Harrison sat back on his heels, his professional mask completely gone now, replaced by the raw face of a man confronting his worst nightmare. "There's a condition, catalepsy. It's extraordinarily rare, maybe a few hundred documented cases worldwide. It can mimic death so completely that even experienced medical professionals can be fooled. The body enters a state of extreme rigidity and suspended animation. Breathing and heart rate slow to almost undetectable levels. And you didn't check times for this?" Marcus's voice was sharp. "There's no way to check for it in the field," Dr. Harrison shot back, his guilt turning to defensive anger. "It requires specialized equipment, EEG monitoring, blood gas analysis, things we don't have at accident scenes in rural counties. I followed every protocol. I did everything by the book. And the book almost killed my son." Silence, heavy and accusatory. David's hand twitched. Just a small movement, fingers curling slightly, but everyone saw it. Everyone except Brian, who'd already known, who'd been trying to tell them. Who'd refused to give up, even when every human in the room had accepted defeat. "How long was he conscious?" Susan asked quietly. "In the coffin, how long was he aware?" Dr. Harrison's face told her everything she didn't want to know. "Cataleptic patients are sometimes aware," he said softly. "Trapped in their bodies. Unable to move or communicate. But conscious, if he was in that state during the accident, during the examination, during the, he couldn't finish, during the viewing, during the hours of people crying over his coffin while he lay paralyzed inside, trying to move, trying to call out, trapped in his own body like a living nightmare." "Oh, David." Susan's tears came fresh and hot. She pressed her face against her son's cold hand. "Oh, baby. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Brian licked David's cheek again. And this time, impossibly, miraculously, David's eye moved to track the motion. Not much, just a slight shift. But it was there. He could see them. He could see Brian. He knew they'd found him. The sound of sirens split the night outside. The ambulance was here. Help was coming. But the real help, the critical, life-saving intervention had already happened. A golden retriever named Brian, who loved his owner enough to fight reality itself, had refused to let them bury a living man. And in doing so, he'd saved a life that every expert in the room had declared lost. But that's not even the crazy part. The crazy part was what they discovered when they got David to the hospital. The emergency room at County General had seen its share of strange cases, but a man rising from the dead, that was new. Patient is David Patterson, age 32, initially pronounced dead approximately 18 hours ago following a motor vehicle accident, the paramedic reported as they wheeled David through the automatic doors. Currently presenting with extreme bradycardia, respiratory depression, and cataleptic rigidity, GCS is approximately 4. BP is 70/40. O2 sat is 82% on room air. The ER attending Dr. Melissa Shaw, who'd worked trauma for 15 years, stopped mid-step. I'm sorry, did you say time's pronounced dead asterisk? 18 hours ago, family dog refused to accept the death. Led to discovery that patient was still alive. Doctor. Shaw looked at the paramedic like he'd grown a second head. Then she looked at David, whose eyes were now fully open but still glassy and unfocused. Then she looked at the golden retriever, who was absolutely refusing to leave the gurney, despite 3 people trying to gently remove him. The dog rode in the ambulance, the paramedic explained with a helpless shrug. Patient became agitated when we tried to separate them. Heart rate spiked to dangerous levels. We made the call to allow the dog to stay with him. This is absolutely against, Dr. Shaw started, then stopped herself. Because David's hand, barely mobile, moving with glacial slowness, had found Brian's fur and was gripping it, weakly, but unmistakably. Fine. The dog stays until we stabilize him. Someone get me a full trauma workup, CBC, metabolic panel, blood gas, and for God's sake, someone call neurology down here, and toxicology. I want to know if there's anything in his system that could cause this kind of... It's not drugs, Dr. Harrison said quietly. He'd insisted on riding in the ambulance, his medical bag clutched to his chest like a shield. Or maybe like a burden. It's catalepsy. I missed it. Dr. Shaw's expression softened slightly. She'd heard of cases like this, medical professionals destroyed by honest mistakes, by the limitations of field diagnostics, by rare conditions that masquerade as death. But she didn't have time for compassion right now. Someone get me everything we have on catalepsy, she ordered. Treatment protocols, case studies, anything. And get me Dr. Reeves from Neuro. He did a research fellowship on rare movement disorders. The ER exploded into organized chaos. Nurses drew blood. Techs hooked David up to monitors that immediately started alarming. His heart rate was dangerously low, his oxygen saturation dropping. They intubated him quickly, gently pushing Brian aside to get to David's airway. The dog whined but allowed it, seeming to understand that these people were trying to help. Susan and Marcus stood in the corner, holding on to each other, watching their family member be systematically assessed and treated. Every alarm, every urgent voice, every rushing footstep felt like a countdown to something they couldn't control. Is he going to make it? Marcus asked nobody in particular. Nobody answered, because nobody knew. Dr. Reeves arrived 12 minutes later, a tall man with silver hair and the calm demeanor of someone who'd seen the impossible multiple times. He took one look at David's chart, one look at the patient, and his eyebrows rose. Well, he said mildly, that's certainly not something you see every day. Can you help him? Susan's voice was raw. Dr. Reeves moved to David's bedside, conducting a rapid neurological assessment. He checked reflexes, response to stimuli, pupil dilation. Brian watched every movement with intense focus, as if evaluating whether this new human was competent enough to treat his owner. The good news, Dr. Reeves said, after a long moment, is that catalepsy itself isn't typically fatal. The bad news is that being in a cataleptic state for this long, combined with the original accident trauma, has put enormous strain on his system. His oxygen levels have been critically low for hours. That means potential brain damage, organ damage, cardiac complications. But he's alive, Susan said fiercely. He's times alive asterisk. Yes. Dr. Reeves smiled gently. Thanks, I'm told, to your dog. Brian's ears perked up at that, like he understood he was being praised. I need to run some tests, doctor. Reeves continued. EEG, to assess brain activity. MRI, to check for stroke or hemorrhage. Echocardiogram, to evaluate cardiac function. It's going to be several hours before we have a complete picture. But I can tell you this, he looked directly at Susan and Marcus. If you'd buried him when you planned to, if the dog hadn't insisted something was wrong, your son would have regained consciousness 6 feet underground. The cataleptic state typically breaks on its own within 24 to 48 hours. He would have woken up in a coffin, unable to move properly, suffocating slowly in the dark. The horror of that settled over the room like a shroud. But he didn't, Dr. Reeves added quietly, because a dog knew better than all of us. Over the next 3 hours, they ran every test imaginable. The results came back in pieces, each one a small miracle. Brain activity was present and surprisingly normal. Some hypoxic damage to the temporal lobe, but nothing catastrophic. Cardiac function was strained, but recovering. The extreme bradycardia was already improving with treatment. No spinal injuries from the accident, no internal bleeding, no pulmonary embolisms. It's like his body put itself into the most extreme protective state possible, Dr. Reeves explained to the family as he reviewed the results. The catalepsy may have actually saved him from worse trauma during the accident. It's almost unprecedented. When will he wake up? Marcus asked. Soon. We're bringing him out of the cataleptic state gradually, with medication. We don't want to shock his system. But I expect he'll be conscious within the next few hours. And when he is, Dr. Reeves paused, he's going to need psychiatric support. The trauma of being trapped like that, aware but unable to communicate, is profound. We'll need to, Brian barked. Once, sharp, urgent, everyone turned to look at the dog, who was staring intently at David's face. And that's when David's eyes focused. Not the glassy, unfocused stare from before. Real focus, real awareness. His gaze locked onto Brian first, of course it did, and something that looked like relief flooded his expression. David, Susan rushed to the bedside. Baby, can you hear me? His eyes moved to her. He couldn't speak, the intubation tube prevented that, but he blinked deliberately. Once for yes, she remembered from when he was a kid, playing games where he'd pretend to be paralyzed by villains. Once, yes, I hear you. The tears came then for everyone. Relief, joy, residual horror, guilt, gratitude. It all mixed together in a wave of emotion that nobody tried to contain. Dr. Shaw moved forward to check his vitals. David, I'm Dr. Shaw. You're in the hospital. You were in an accident. You're safe now. Do you understand? Blink. Yes. We're going to remove the breathing tube in a moment. You might feel some discomfort, but it will help you breathe easier, okay? Blink. Yes. But David's eyes had returned to Brian, who'd managed to wiggle closer to the bed despite the nurse's attempts to keep him at a distance. The dog's tail was wagging so hard his entire back half was shaking. He made small, happy sounds, not quite whines, not quite barks, just pure joy. I think, Dr. Reeves said with a slight smile, your dog would like some acknowledgement for his heroic efforts. David's hand moved slowly, still hampered by the lingering cataleptic rigidity, but it moved. His fingers found Brian's head, scratched behind his ear in that familiar spot, and the dog's eyes closed in contentment. The heart rate monitor actually showed David's pulse times strengthening times at the contact, like Brian's presence was medicine in itself. Remarkable, Dr. Reeves murmured. The psychosomatic healing effects of human-animal bonds are well documented, but this is extraordinary. They removed the breathing tube 15 minutes later. David coughed, gasped, then took his first real breath in nearly 20 hours. It was raspy and painful, but it was times his asterisk. His first word was barely a whisper, rough as gravel, but everyone heard it. Brian. The dog's entire body wiggled with joy. His second word was new. Susan leaned close. What did you know, baby? David's eyes met hers, and the trauma there, the memory of being trapped, aware, unable to move or scream or signal for help, was devastating to witness. But underneath it was something else, something stronger. New, he'd save me. And just like that, a golden retriever became a legend. But the story doesn't end there, because what happened next would reveal just how deep the bond between David and Brian really went. 3 days later, when David was stable enough for coherent conversation, Dr. Reeves brought in a psychiatrist specializing in trauma. Dr. Chen, no relation to the neighbor, had extensive experience with patients who'd survived near-death experiences, particularly cases involving prolonged conscious immobility. I need you to understand, Doctor, Chen said gently, settling into the chair beside David's hospital bed, that what you experienced is one of the most psychologically traumatic events a person can endure. Being trapped in your body, aware but unable to communicate, it's a form of torture. We need to process this carefully. David nodded slowly. He'd regained most of his mobility, though he still moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had betrayed him. Brian was curled up on the bed beside him against hospital policy. But nobody had the heart to enforce the rules at this point. Can you tell me what you remember? Dr. Chen asked. Take your time. If you need to stop, we stop. David's hand found Brian's fur, anchoring himself. Then he spoke. The accident happened so fast. 1 second I was driving, the next the car was rolling. I remember. Fragments, metal screaming, glass, pain, then nothing. When did you regain consciousness? At the accident scene. I could hear people shouting, EMTs working on me, someone saying there was no pulse. I tried to move, tried to speak, but my body wouldn't respond. It was like being buried alive in my own skin. Susan, sitting in the corner with Marcus, made a small sound of distress. David glanced at her apologetically, before continuing. I heard Dr. Harrison pronounce me dead. Heard him tell the EMTs to stop resuscitation efforts. And I was screaming inside my head, I'm here, I'm alive, don't stop, but nothing came out. Not a sound, not a movement, nothing. That must have been terrifying, Dr. Chen said quietly. Terrifying doesn't cover it. They loaded me into a vehicle I couldn't see, could barely feel, but I knew I was moving. Heard the engine, heard voices talking about arrangements, funeral homes, autopsies. He paused, swallowing hard. I kept trying to move, anything, a finger twitch, an eye flutter, but the paralysis was complete. How long were you conscious during this? The whole time. Every minute of those 18 hours. I felt them preparing my body. The funeral home, the cold table, the embalming equipment being set up. They hadn't started the actual process yet, thank God. But I heard them discussing it, planning it, choosing he couldn't finish. Brian whined softly, pressing closer. Then they moved me to the coffin. I felt them positioning me, folding my hands. Someone, the funeral director, maybe commenting on how peaceful I looked. Peaceful. I was trapped in a nightmare, and I looked times peaceful asterisk. That must have been when you were brought home, Marcus said quietly. Yeah. I could hear Mom crying, neighbors coming in, offering condolences, people touching the coffin, saying goodbye. And I kept trying, trying times to move, to make a sound, to do times anything times to let them know I was still here. But you couldn't, Dr. Chen said. No, except, David's expression shifted. Something like hope, or maybe gratitude, softened the trauma in his eyes. Except Brian. The moment he came close to the coffin, I felt different. Like my body recognized him even if it couldn't move, and he times knew immediately. He didn't act like I was dead, he acted like I was in trouble. Dogs have extraordinary sensory perception, Dr. Chen noted. They can detect changes in human physiology that our instruments miss, heart rate variations, breathing patterns, chemical changes. It was more than that. David's voice grew stronger. I could hear him outside the coffin. The way he was breathing, the sounds he made, it wasn't grief. It was problem solving, like he was trying to figure out how to get to me. And every time he touched the coffin, every time he pressed his nose against the wood, I swear, I felt it. Like his presence was reaching through to me. Susan was crying openly now. He wouldn't leave, not for anything. I heard you all talking about it. Heard people saying he was just grieving, that we should get him away from the coffin. And I was screaming inside, no, listen to him. He's trying to tell you. But nothing came out. When did you regain the ability to move? Dr. Chen asked. Gradually. Very gradually. First, just the smallest sense of my fingers. Then I managed to curl them, just slightly. But it took everything I had, and the movement was so minimal I didn't think anyone would notice. Then I tried tapping using whatever tiny amount of control I'd regained to knock against the coffin lid. Small movements, but deliberate. That's when we heard it, Marcus said. The sounds from inside. And Brian went crazy. Not in a panicked way, in a listen to me way. Like he was trying to translate what I was doing into something you'd understand. David's eyes met his dog's, and the gratitude there was overwhelming. He was my voice, when I had none. Dr. Chen made notes, nodding. This bond you have with Brian, it's clearly profound. Had you trained him in any specific alert behaviors? No, we've always been close. From the day I brought him home from the shelter, it was like we understood each other. He'd know when I'd had a bad shift before I walked through the door. He'd sense when I needed company versus space. But this, David shook his head, this was beyond anything I could have trained or expected. This was pure instinct and love. I've reviewed the medical reports, Dr. Chen said. The cataleptic state you experienced is extraordinarily rare. There are documented cases of people being mistakenly pronounced dead throughout history, but in the modern era, with our diagnostic tools, it's almost unheard of. You're incredibly fortunate that I have, Brian, David interrupted. That's the only reason I'm here. If it had been any other pet, any other situation. He didn't finish, didn't need to. There's something else I need to tell you, Doctor, Chen said gently. We ran extensive neurological tests while you were recovering. The scans showed something interesting. Do you remember anything unusual before the accident? Any episodes of temporary paralysis? Moments where you couldn't move or speak but were fully conscious? David frowned. Actually, yeah. A few times over the past year. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, completely paralyzed. Couldn't move. Couldn't call out. It would last a few minutes, then pass. I thought it was just sleep paralysis, stress from the job. It was catalepsy, Dr. Chen explained. Minor episodes building up to the major one during your accident. Your condition has been developing for months, possibly longer. The accident didn't cause the catalepsy, it triggered a massive cataleptic episode in someone who was already predisposed to them. So this could happen again? Susan asked, alarmed. We can manage it now that we know about it, Dr. Reeves interjected, entering the room. Medication, monitoring, avoiding triggers. But David, you need to understand, without Brian's intervention, your condition would have remained undiagnosed. The next episode might have occurred when you were alone, or in a situation where nobody would have questioned the diagnosis of death. Your dog didn't just save your life. He revealed a condition that could have killed you multiple times over. The weight of that settled over everyone. Brian, oblivious to the medical discussion but perfectly attuned to emotional currents, licked David's hand. Just a simple gesture of comfort and companionship. The kind of thing dogs do 1,000 times. Except this time, that gesture carried the weight of a life saved, a family preserved, a tragedy averted. I owe him everything, David said softly. How do you repay a debt like that? You live, Doctor. Chen said simply. You live well, you love him back, and you share this story, because there are other people out there with undiagnosed catalepsy, other families who might face this horror. And if your experience Brian's heroism can prevent even one wrongful death pronouncement, then something good comes from the trauma. David nodded slowly. Then he looked at Brian, really looked at him, with full awareness and gratitude and love, and said the words that would become the headline of every news story that followed. Brian didn't just refuse to let them bury me. He refused to let me be forgotten. He fought for me when I couldn't fight for myself, and I'll spend the rest of my life making sure he knows he's the best thing that ever happened to me. Brian's tail thumped against the hospital bed, and in that moment, everyone in the room understood that they'd witnessed something rare and precious, a bond so strong it could challenge death itself. But the media storm that was about to descend would test that bond in ways nobody expected. The story broke 3 days after David was moved out of intensive care. A nurse, well-meaning, but catastrophically misguided in her understanding of HIPAA, had posted about the case on social media. You won't believe what happened at County General today, the post read, followed by just enough details to make the story identifiable. Within hours, it had been shared thousands of times. Within a day, news outlets were calling. Mr. Patterson, this is Rebecca Chen from CNN. We'd love to speak with you about your experience. David, it's Marcus Rodriguez from NBC. The nation needs to hear this story. Officer Patterson, TMZ here, we're offering an exclusive. The hospital phone rang constantly. Reporters camped outside the building. Social media exploded with the hashtag number Brian the Hero. Someone even created a Twitter account in Brian's name that gained 100,000 followers in 6 hours. David, still recovering both physically and psychologically, was overwhelmed. I can't do this, he told Susan on the 4th day of media siege. I can't talk about the most traumatic experience of my life for entertainment. I can't turn what happened into Times content, asterisk. But the story had taken on a life of its own. News outlets ran with it anyway, interviewing neighbors, the funeral director who quickly became the villain of the narrative, though he'd done nothing wrong, and random people who'd never met David but had opinions about catalepsy, medical malpractice, and the extraordinary intuition of dogs. Dr. Harrison became a target. Online mobs attacked him for missing David's condition. Despite the fact that catalepsy is notoriously difficult to diagnose in emergency situations, he received death threats. His practice suffered. His medical license came under review. "This is my fault," David said when he heard. "If I'd just kept quiet." "It's not your fault, doctor," Chen said firmly during one of their therapy sessions. "You didn't release the story. You didn't ask for this attention. But now that it's here, you have choices about how to respond. You can hide from it, which won't make it go away and might allow misinformation to spread. Or you can control the narrative, tell your truth, advocate for awareness of catalepsy, and protect the people who saved your life. Protect them." Brian is now one of the most famous dogs in America. People will want to meet him, touch him, exploit him for photos and publicity. Your family is under scrutiny. Dr. Harrison is being crucified. The narrative is out of control, David. You're the only one who can rein it in. So David made a decision. He would give one interview, comprehensive, honest, and on his own terms. He would set the record straight, defend Dr. Harrison, raise awareness of catalepsy, and then disappear back into private life. He chose a local journalist he trusted, someone who'd covered the police department fairly for years. The interview would be filmed in the hospital courtyard, with Brian present. Susan and Marcus would be there. Dr. Harrison would be invited to participate if he wanted. The day of the interview, David was nervous. He'd regained most of his strength, but the psychological scars were still fresh. Dr. Chen had warned him that talking about the trauma in detail might trigger flashbacks, dissociation, or panic attacks. "We can stop at any time," Susan reminded him as they set up. "You don't owe anyone this." "I owe it to Brian," David said quietly, "and to anyone else out there who might experience what I did, if my story saves one life." The journalist Karen Wu, mid-40s, known for her sensitivity in trauma reporting, settled across from David with a kind smile. Brian lay at David's feet, calm but alert. "Thank you for doing this," Karen said. "I know it's not easy." "Nothing about this has been easy," David replied. "But it's necessary. Let's start with the basics. Can you walk me through what happened from your perspective?" And David did. He spoke clearly and honestly about the accident, the paralysis, the horror of being conscious but unable to communicate. He described the hours in the coffin, the desperation, the moment when Brian refused to accept his death. "People are calling him a hero," Karen said. "Do you agree with that characterization?" "Absolutely. But he's more than a hero. David paused, searching for words. "He's proof that love can transcend the limitations we place on understanding. He couldn't have known intellectually that I was alive. But he knew times, emotionally, instinctively. He trusted what he felt over what he was being told. And that trust saved my life." Some people are criticizing the medical professionals involved. Dr. Harrison in particular has faced significant backlash. What's your response to that? David's expression hardened slightly, not with anger toward Karen, but with protective determination. Dr. Harrison did everything right. Catalepsy is extraordinarily rare. The diagnostic tools available at an accident scene are limited. He followed every protocol. To blame him for not diagnosing a condition that mimics death so completely is not just unfair, it's dangerous. It will make doctors second-guess themselves in genuine emergencies, potentially costing lives. He looked directly at the camera. "Dr. Harrison, if you're watching this, you didn't fail me. You did your best with the information and resources you had. This is not your fault. And anyone attacking you needs to understand that medicine is not always black and white. Sometimes, even when you do everything right, the outcome seems wrong. But you did nothing wrong." Karen nodded approvingly. "That's very generous. It's just honest." David's hand found Brian's head, scratching absently. "The real villain here isn't any person. It's the limitations of current medical diagnostics, the rarity of conditions like catalepsy, and the fact that we don't have better systems in place to catch these cases. If anything good comes from my experience, I hope it's increased research funding for rare neurological conditions and better diagnostic protocols for field medicine." "What about Brian? What happens to him now?" David smiled, the first genuine smile of the interview. Brian goes home with me. He sleeps on my bed, eats the best food I can afford, and gets told he's a good boy approximately 600 times a day. He's not a media spectacle. He's not a prop. He's my family, and he's going to live a quiet, happy life where the most exciting thing that happens is deciding which toy to destroy next. Brian's tail wagged at that, like he understood and approved of the plan. One last question, Karen said gently. You've been through extraordinary trauma. How are you coping? David took a breath. Honestly, some days are harder than others. I have nightmares about being trapped again. Sometimes I wake up and can't move for a few seconds, and the panic is intense. I'm working with an excellent therapist. I have the support of my family, and I have Brian, who seems to instinctively know when I need extra comfort. Do you think you'll fully recover? I think recovery from something like this isn't linear. It's not about getting back to who I was before that person didn't know he had catalepsy, didn't know how close death could come, didn't understand the depth of what true loyalty looks like. I'm someone new now, changed, but not broken. He paused, then added, and I'm grateful, which sounds crazy, right? Being grateful for trauma? But I am. Because it showed me that when everything else fails, medicine, technology, human judgment, love doesn't. Love persists. Love fights. Love refuses to accept defeat. He looked down at Brian, and the dog looked back with those brown eyes full of devotion and joy. Love saves lives, and in my case, it wore a golden coat and answered to Brian. The interview aired that evening. It went viral immediately, not in the exploitative, sensationalized way David had feared, but in a profound, touching way that moved people to tears. The backlash against Dr. Harrison ceased almost overnight. Donations poured into catalepsy research organizations. Support groups formed for people who'd experienced similar near-death consciousness. And Brian became more than a viral sensation. He became a symbol of the extraordinary bond between humans and animals, proof that sometimes the most loyal souls come with 4 legs and a wagging tail. But the real measure of Brian's impact wouldn't be seen in news coverage or social media trends. It would be seen in what happened next when the mail started arriving. The first letter arrived 2 weeks after David came home from the hospital. It was handwritten, the script shaky, from an elderly woman in Ohio. Asterisk, Dear David and Brian. Asterisk. Asterisk. My name is Margaret. I'm 73 years old, and 2 years ago, my husband was pronounced dead from a massive stroke. We buried him 3 days later. I always wondered if he might have been like you, trapped, aware, trying to tell us he was still there. Your story brought it all back, but it also gave me peace. If there had been a way to know, our dog Buster would have known, just like Brian knew. He didn't act the way Brian did, which means my husband truly was at peace. Asterisk. Asterisk. Thank you for sharing your truth. You've helped an old woman finally let go of her guilt. Asterisk. Asterisk. With love. Asterisk. Asterisk. Margaret. Asterisk. Susan read it aloud to David and Marcus, her voice breaking. She's not the only one, Marcus said quietly, gesturing to the pile of mail that had accumulated. There are dozens of these, maybe hundreds. David sat on the couch. Brian pressed against his side in the spot that had become permanently his. He reached for another letter, this one from a young man in Texas. Asterisk. Officer Patterson. Asterisk. Asterisk. I have catalepsy. I was diagnosed 5 years ago, after a minor episode. Nobody believed me at first. The doctors thought I was faking or experiencing psychosomatic symptoms, but tests eventually confirmed it. I've been living in fear ever since, terrified that one day I'll have a major episode like yours and won't be lucky enough to have a Brian. Asterisk. Asterisk. Your story has given me the courage to be more vocal about my condition. I'm working with my family to create emergency protocols. We're training our dog to recognize the signs of an episode. I'm wearing a medical alert bracelet with explicit instructions. Asterisk. Asterisk. You've probably saved my life by sharing what happened to you. Thank you doesn't seem like enough. Asterisk. Asterisk Jake M. Asterisk. Jesus, David whispered. How many people are living with this and don't even know? The letters kept coming. Stories of near misses, of pets who'd exhibited unusual behavior around sick owners, of people who'd survived against impossible odds because someone or sometimes dog times refused to give up. But one letter in particular caught David's attention. It was from a veterinarian in Oregon, postmarked a week after the interview aired. Asterisk, Officer Patterson, asterisk, asterisk. My name is Dr. Sarah Matthews, and I specialize in animal behavior and cognition. What Brian did is extraordinary, but it's not unprecedented. Dogs, particularly those with strong bonds to their owners, have demonstrated remarkable abilities to detect medical conditions. Asterisk, asterisk. Some dogs can alert to seizures before they happen. Others detect cancer through scent. Some sense drops in blood sugar for diabetic owners. The scientific community is only beginning to understand the full scope of canine medical intuition. Asterisk. Asterisk. I believe Brian deserves formal recognition for what he did. More importantly, I believe he could help train other dogs to detect cataleptic states and other conditions that mimic death. Asterisk. Asterisk. Would you be willing to discuss this further? I think there's potential here to save many more lives. Asterisk. Asterisk. Respectfully. Asterisk. Asterisk. Dr. Sarah Matthews, asterisk. David stared at the letter for a long time. Brian, sensing his owner's contemplation, nudged his hand. What do you think, buddy? David asked softly. Want to be a teacher? Brian's tail wagged slowly, thoughtfully, as if he were actually considering the question. David, you don't have to do anything, Susan said firmly. You've been through enough. You deserve to rest, to recover, to live your life without using what happened to help others? David interrupted gently. Mom, I almost died. I was hours times away from being buried alive. And the only reason I'm here is because of Brian. If he can teach other dogs to do what he did, if we can create early warning systems for people with catalepsy or other rare conditions, it's a lot to take on, Marcus said. You're still recovering. Mentally, physically, which is exactly why I understand the urgency. David's voice was quiet but firm. There's someone out there right now who has undiagnosed catalepsy. Someone who might have an accident or an episode tomorrow, next week, next year. And they might not have a Brian. But what if they could? What if we could train dogs to recognize the signs that medical equipment misses? He looked at the pile of letters. Each one, a story, a plea, a thank you. These people are counting on us. They're trusting us to turn tragedy into purpose. How can I say no to that? Susan's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. Then we do it. We do it carefully, with your health as the priority, but we do it. David called Dr. Matthews that evening. The conversation lasted 2 hours and covered everything from canine olfactory capabilities to the specific behaviors Brian had exhibited to potential training protocols. I need to meet Brian, Dr. Matthews said. Study his behavior patterns. Understand exactly what signs he was picking up on. If we can identify the specific physiological markers he was detecting, changes in breath pattern, chemical emissions, subtle vibrations, we can train other dogs to recognize them. When can you come? David asked. I can be there in 3 days. But David? Her voice grew serious. This is going to be intense. It means reliving aspects of the trauma. Brian will be working, not just relaxing. Are you sure you're ready? David looked at Brian, who was watching him with those attentive, loving eyes. I'm sure, he said. Because if Brian's willing to work, the least I can do is support him. Dr. Matthews arrived on a Thursday afternoon with a team of researchers and a van full of equipment. Brian, who was usually friendly to strangers, took one look at all the people and pressed himself against David's leg protectively. It's okay, boy, David murmured. They're here to learn from you. You're going to be a teacher now. What followed was 3 weeks of intensive study. Dr. Matthews and her team observed Brian's behavior around David during rest, activity, and controlled stress situations. They measured David's physiological responses during minor cataleptic episodes, induced carefully under medical supervision. They documented exactly what Brian did when he detected anomalies. The results were astounding. Brian doesn't just respond to one marker, Dr. Matthews explained during a debriefing session. He's synthesizing multiple data points. Changes in your breathing pattern specifically, the gap between exhales, alterations in your body temperature. And here's the fascinating part. He's detecting a chemical signature in your sweat that changes during cataleptic episodes. Something related to stress hormones, but more specific. So other dogs could learn this? Susan asked. Potentially. Service dogs are already trained to detect seizures, blood sugar changes, even certain types of cancer. Adding catalepsy detection to their repertoire is absolutely feasible. Brian is showing us exactly what to train for. They started working with other dogs, carefully selected golden retrievers, Labradors, and German shepherds, known for their strong bonds with handlers. Brian became, essentially, a mentor. Under Dr. Matthews's guidance, he would demonstrate the behaviors he'd used with David, the focused listening, the specific pawing pattern, the alert but not panicked demeanor. It was exhausting work, but Brian seemed to understand its importance. He was patient with the other dogs, gentle but instructive. And when a young golden retriever, named Luna, successfully identified a simulated cataleptic episode in a volunteer, Brian's tail wagged with what looked suspiciously like pride. He knows, Dr. Matthews said, amazed. He understands that he's teaching them to save lives. The program expanded rapidly. Medical alert organizations took notice. Funding came through. Within 6 months, they had the framework for a national training program. Catalepsy detection dogs, specially trained to recognize the subtle signs that medical equipment might miss. And it all started because one golden retriever refused to accept that his owner was dead. But the most profound impact wasn't the training program or the research or the media attention. It was what happened when David and Brian visited hospitals. The invitation came from County General's Chief of Medicine herself. "We have patients, Doctor," Patel explained during the phone call. "People in comas, locked-in syndrome, minimally conscious states. Their families are, well, they're struggling. They've heard your story. They want to meet Brian. And honestly, I think it might help." David hesitated. "I'm not sure what Brian could do for them." "Hope," Dr. Patel said simply. "You'd be surprised how powerful that is in medical settings." So they started making visits. Once a week, David and Brian would go to County General's long-term care wing. They'd visit patients who lay motionless, whose families kept vigil beside beeping machines, who existed in that terrible liminal space between life and death. The first visit was to a woman named Patricia, 48, who'd suffered a massive stroke 6 months earlier. She was in what doctors called a minimally conscious state, possibly aware, but unable to communicate. "We don't know if she can hear us," Patricia's daughter said, tears streaming down her face. "We talk to her, play her favorite music, but there's no response, no sign that she's in there." Brian approached Patricia's bed, slowly, carefully. He sniffed the air, tilted his head, then did something extraordinary. He placed his paw on Patricia's hand and waited. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. Then Patricia's finger twitched. Just once, barely perceptible, but David saw it. Patricia's daughter saw it, and Brian saw it. His tail started wagging, and he looked back at David with an expression that clearly said, asterisk, "She's in there, asterisk." "Oh my God," Patricia's daughter whispered. "Did you see?" Patricia's eye moved. Not much. Just a slight shift toward Brian. But it was times movement asterisk, the first voluntary movement she'd made in 6 months. The medical staff rushed to document it. More tests were ordered. And while the doctors cautioned against reading too much into a single incident, Patricia's daughter had hope for the first time in half a year. "Brian knew," she said to David as they left. "Just like he knew you were alive. He sees something the machines can't measure." The visits continued. Not every patient responded the way Patricia had. Some remained unchanged, but others, enough others to matter, showed small signs of consciousness when Brian was present. A hand squeeze here, an eye movement there. Tiny miracles that gave families reason to keep hoping. "It's not magic," Dr. Reeves explained to David after the 5th such incident. "It's biology. Dogs emit pheromones that can have calming effects on humans. They provide sensory stimulation that's different from mechanical touch. And their behavior, Brian's obvious attention and care, might be reaching parts of these patients' awareness that we can't access through traditional means." "So he's actually helping them?" "Absolutely. We're documenting measurable increases in brain activity during his visits. Not enough to wake someone from a coma, but enough to suggest that the patient is more aware when Brian is present. It's remarkable." But the visit that would become legendary happened 3 months into the program. A teenage boy named Marcus, yes, the same name as David's brother, which felt like fate, had been in a coma for 8 months following a skateboarding accident. 17 years old, his whole life ahead of him, trapped in silence. His parents had been trying everything: music therapy, familiar scents, recordings of friends and family. Nothing had worked. They were approaching the point where doctors start talking about long-term care facilities and withdrawing life support. "We heard about Brian," Marcus's mother said when David and Brian arrived. "We thought, maybe, if there's even a chance." Brian approached Marcus's bed with his usual careful attention. He sniffed, listened, then looked at David with an expression that seemed to say, "This is different, asterisk." He jumped onto the bed, something he'd never done during hospital visits, and curled up beside Marcus, right against his side, head resting on the boy's chest, listening to his heartbeat. "Brian, down," David started to say, but Dr. Reeves held up a hand. "Wait, look at the monitors." Marcus's heart rate was changing. Not dramatically, just a slight increase. His brain activity, measured by the EEG they'd started running during Brian's visits, was spiking. "He's responding," Dr. Reeves whispered. "Keep the dog there." For 20 minutes, Brian lay beside Marcus. And slowly, incrementally, the boy's vital signs strengthened. His breathing deepened. His brain activity continued to increase. Then his hand moved. Not a twitch. Not a random muscle spasm. His hand moved deliberately to rest on Brian's back. Marcus's mother sobbed. His father grabbed the nurse's arm. "Is he?" "Don't get too excited," Dr. Reeves cautioned, but there was wonder in his voice. "This could be—" Marcus's eyes opened. Not the blank, unfocused stare of someone in a vegetative state. Clear, aware eyes that looked directly at Brian, then at his parents, then back to Brian. "Dog," he whispered. His first word in 8 months. The room erupted. Doctors rushed in. Nurses called for additional monitoring. Marcus's parents were laughing and crying simultaneously, holding their son's hand, while he slowly, carefully, woke up from 8 months of darkness. And Brian, calm as ever, just kept his position beside the boy, tail wagging gently, like this was exactly what he'd expected to happen. David stood in the corner, watching it all unfold, and felt tears streaming down his face, because he understood in a way most people couldn't what Marcus had just been through: the terror of being trapped, the isolation, the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, would realize you were still in there. And Brian, incredible Brian, had done it again. "How?" Marcus's father asked later, after the immediate chaos had calmed and Marcus was undergoing a barrage of neurological tests. "How does a dog do this?" "I don't know," David admitted, "but I've stopped trying to explain it. Brian understands something about consciousness that we don't. He recognizes the spark of awareness even when it's buried deep. And somehow, his presence calls to that spark, coaxes it back toward the surface." "You've given us our son back," Marcus's mother said, clutching David's hands. "We'd given up hope. They were talking about ending life support next month. And you, Brian, you gave us a miracle." "Brian gave you what he gave me," David said quietly. "A second chance. And the knowledge that even in our darkest moments, we're not alone. Someone's looking for us. Someone refuses to give up." The story made national news again, but this time David was ready for it. He gave one interview, carefully controlled, explaining the hospital visit program and advocating for increased research into consciousness detection and animal-assisted therapy. More hospitals reached out. More families asked for visits. Brian became busier than most working dogs, but he seemed to thrive on it. Like he'd found his purpose not just as David's companion, but as a bridge between the living and those trapped in states the medical world couldn't fully understand. And through it all, Brian remained fundamentally himself. A gentle, loving golden retriever who just happened to see the world in a way that saved lives. But there was one more visit to make. One more person who needed to meet the dog who'd changed everything. Number, Chapter 10. Full circle. Dr. Harrison had resigned from his practice. Not because of the investigation that had cleared him completely, finding no evidence of malpractice. Not because of the lawsuits, those had been dropped after David's public defense. But because he couldn't shake the memory of looking at David Patterson's corpse and declaring him dead. "I keep thinking about it," he told David when they met at a quiet coffee shop 6 months after the incident. What if you'd been alone? What if there had been no Brian? I would have sent you to be embalmed, buried, and I would never have known I'd made a mistake. It wasn't a mistake, David said firmly. They'd had this conversation before, but Harrison needed to hear it again. You did everything right with the information and tools you had. It wasn't enough. No, but that's not your failing, it's the system's. And we're changing that now, aren't we? Harrison looked up, confused. David smiled. Dr. Matthews's program doesn't just train dogs. We're developing new diagnostic protocols for field medicine. Portable equipment that can detect the subtle vital signs that standard checks miss. Better training for EMTs and emergency physicians on rare conditions like catalepsy. And you know who's helping develop those protocols? Who? You are, if you want. Harrison's eyes widened. What? Your experience, the mistake you think you made, is invaluable. You know exactly what the diagnostic challenges are in field situations. You understand the pressure, the limitations, the split-second decisions that have to be made. We need that expertise to create better systems. David, I don't think I can. You saved my life, David interrupted. Maybe not in the way you intended, but you did. You were honest about what happened. You didn't try to cover it up or blame anyone else. You took responsibility, even though there was nothing to be responsible for. That integrity is exactly what we need in this program. Harrison was quiet for a long moment. Then, I'd like to meet Brian. Properly, I mean. Not in a hospital room during a crisis. He's outside, David said with a grin. Been waiting for you. They walked out to the courtyard where Brian was lounging in the sun, held by Susan. The moment Brian saw Harrison, his tail started wagging. Not warily, joyfully. Like he was greeting an old friend. Harrison knelt down slowly, and Brian approached with his characteristic gentleness. The doctor's hands were shaking as he reached out to pet Brian's head. Thank you, Harrison whispered. Thank you for being smarter than me. Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for being exactly who you are. Brian licked his hand, and Harrison broke down. 6 months of guilt, shame, fear, and grief came pouring out in great, heaving sobs. And Brian, patient as always, just leaned against him, providing the comfort that only a dog can give. David and Susan gave them space, watching from a distance. He's going to be okay, Susan said quietly. We're all going to be okay, David replied. Because we're not carrying this alone anymore. We're turning trauma into purpose. Pain into progress. And Brian's showing us how. The months that followed saw tremendous changes. The Catalepsy Awareness Foundation was established, funded by donations from people who'd been moved by David's story. They provided medical alert bracelets, funded research, and created support networks for patients and families. The Brian Protocol, named in honor of the dog who'd started it all, became standard training for catalepsy detection dogs. 30 dogs completed the program in the first year, placed with high-risk individuals and medical facilities. Patricia, the stroke patient Brian had visited, regained significant function and was able to return home. Young Marcus made a full recovery and started advocating for increased funding for coma research. Dr. Harrison joined Dr. Matthews's team, developing field diagnostic tools that could detect the subtle signs of catalepsy and other conditions that mimic death. The equipment saved 3 lives in its first year of use. And David? He returned to police work, with Brian certified as his official partner. They patrolled together, trained together, and occasionally visited schools to teach children about the incredible capabilities of service animals. But their most important work continued to be the hospital visits. Every week, they'd go to County General and other facilities, bringing hope to families and patients navigating the terrible uncertainty of consciousness disorders. You know what the craziest part is? David said to Dr. Chen during one of their increasingly infrequent therapy sessions. He was healing, slowly but surely. What's that? People call Brian a hero. They write articles about his extraordinary intuition, his medical detection abilities, his life-saving interventions. And all of that's true. But to him, he was just doing what dogs do. He was loving his person, refusing to abandon his pack member, being loyal in the purest, simplest way. David paused, scratching behind Brian's ear. We make it complicated, the science, the training, the protocols. But at its core, what saved my life was the most basic thing in the world: unconditional love. A dog who loved his owner so much that he refused to accept what everyone else said was true. "That's beautiful," Dr. Chen said softly. "It's everything," David replied. "Because in those hours when I was trapped in my body, when I was conscious, but helpless, when I'd given up hope that anyone would realize I was still alive, Brian hadn't given up. He was there, fighting for me, believing in me, refusing to let me go. And that knowledge, that I wasn't alone, that I was loved enough to be saved, that's what kept me holding on." He looked at Brian, who gazed back with those warm, intelligent eyes. "People ask me all the time if I believe in miracles now, and I tell them yes, absolutely. But miracles don't always look like divine intervention or impossible physics. Sometimes they look like a golden retriever who trusts his heart over everyone else's expertise, who knows his person is alive even when science says otherwise, who turns love into action and refuses to quit until justice is done." "What will you tell people when they ask about the biggest lesson you learned from all this?" Dr. Chen asked. David smiled. "That the most powerful force in the universe isn't technology or medicine or human intelligence. It's the bond between souls who refuse to let go of each other. It's loyalty that transcends logic. It's love that challenges death itself and wins." He stood, Brian rising with him, moving in that synchronized way they had two beings so attuned to each other that they functioned as one. "And I'll tell them that if they're ever lucky enough to have someone human or animal love them the way Brian loves me, they should cherish it, protect it, honor it. Because that kind of love doesn't just save lives." He looked out the window at the world beyond, full of people and possibilities and second chances. It redeems them. 2 years after the incident, David and Susan stood in the auditorium at the National Veterinary Medical Association's annual conference. Brian, wearing a special vest marking him as a certified medical alert dog and program founder, sat calmly between them. They were about to receive the Heroic Animals Award, one of the highest honors in veterinary medicine. "I'm nervous," David admitted. "He's not," Susan said, gesturing to Brian, whose tail was wagging peacefully as he watched the crowd gather. When their names were called, they walked to the stage together. The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes. People were crying. Dr. Matthews was beaming from the front row. Dr. Harrison, now the lead researcher on field diagnostic equipment, clapped until his hands were red. David took the microphone. Brian sat beside him, looking out at the crowd with calm dignity. 2 years ago, David began, "I was pronounced dead, and I should have been. By every standard medical measure, I appeared to be gone. But one being refused to accept that diagnosis. One soul knew with certainty that transcended training or logic or scientific understanding that I was still fighting to come back." He placed his hand on Brian's head. "This award isn't just for Brian's heroism in refusing to let them bury me alive. It's recognition of something profound, that animals, specifically dogs, possess an understanding of life and consciousness that we're only beginning to comprehend. Brian didn't save me because he was trained to. He saved me because he loved me. And that love gave him clarity that our most advanced medical technology couldn't match." The program that bears his name has now trained 47 dogs in catalepsy detection. Those dogs have prevented 6 wrongful death pronouncements. They've alerted to early-stage cataleptic episodes in 12 patients, allowing for treatment before major incidents occurred. They've brought comfort to hundreds of families facing the uncertainty of consciousness disorders. But more than that, Brian's story has reminded us of something we too often forget in our rush toward technological solutions. That the oldest technology in human history, the bond between people and dogs, remains one of the most powerful tools we have. David's voice grew thick with emotion. "I stand before you today not just as a survivor, but as a testament to the power of that bond. And I hope that everyone here, everyone watching, will remember. When science fails, when technology falls short, when human judgment is imperfect, love doesn't fail. Love persists. Love finds a way. Love time's a pretty time." He knelt beside Brian, wrapping his arms around the dog who'd saved his life, and whispered just loud enough for the microphone to catch, "Good boy, Brian, the very best boy." Brian's tail thumped against the stage. And in that moment, Every person in that auditorium understood that they hadn't just witnessed a story about a hero dog. They'd witnessed proof that the bonds we forge with animals, with each other, with life itself are stronger than death, more persistent than despair, and capable of miracles that no science can fully explain. Brian the golden retriever, who'd refused to let them bury his owner alive, had taught the world something precious. That love, in its purest form, is the greatest life-saving intervention of all.